Before anyone understood who she really was, before the mess hall went silent, before a Marine's career flatlined in the span of a breath, it started with a moment so small most people would have missed it. A woman in a plain navy blue top, standing alone at the edge of a cafeteria full of Marines, pausing as if listening to something the rest of US couldn't hear. And if you agree that some of the strongest warriors in the world walk among us quietly, unnoticed until the very moment everything depends on them, make sure to like and subscribe, because this story proves exactly that. I didn't know then that the next 10 minutes would become the most replayed footage on the base, a cautionary tale whispered in training rooms and chow lines. But I remember the way the air seemed to tighten around her, the way she scanned the tables with a calmness that didn't match her age, 28, maybe 29, though she carried herself with that peculiar gravity you only see in people who've lived 3 lifetimes before 30. Her name, though no one in that room knew it yet, was Lieutenant Commander Talia Reyes, retired, technically, but legends don't retire, they just stop wearing uniforms. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who spent years in places where noise got you killed, slipping her tray onto a table in the far corner. If Staff Sergeant Briggs had stopped to actually look at her, he might have noticed the subtle tells. Her back never fully to a door, her eyes marking exits and reflective surfaces, her muscles coiled in a way that wasn't tension but readiness. But Briggs wasn't someone who looked at people. He judged them, and that was his first mistake. I watched it happen. The collision that wasn't really a collision so much as a deliberate shoulder check, the kind bullies throw when they want to feel tall. Her tray flew, metal clattering across the floor in a sharp burst of sound that cut through the entire room. Briggs laughed, a loud, ugly bark, backed by 2 Marines who had the same smirking, restless energy of men looking to impress the wrong audience. "Move it, B*TCH, he muttered, loud enough for half the mess hall to hear, and the snickers that followed were the kind that twist your stomach. What struck me wasn't the shove, or the insult, or even the way she stumbled forward. It was her reaction. Or rather, the lack of one. No anger, no panic. Just a slow exhale, a microsecond of stillness, like her mind was taking a photograph of everything around her. Later, I'd think back to that moment and realize it was the same stillness I'd seen in combat veterans seconds before something irreversible happened. Briggs puffed up beside her, demanding she apologize, flashing a 40 he hadn't earned. She didn't. She simply met his eyes, and there was something in her expression that made my skin crawl. A quiet, clinical assessment. Like he wasn't a threat, but a problem to solve. When she spoke, her voice was steady, almost gentle. "I'd appreciate it if you stepped aside." That was when Briggs grabbed her arm. Hard. The second his fingers closed around her sleeve, it slid up just enough for me, and only me, at first, to catch a glimpse of the ink on the inside of her forearm. A trident, pitch black, flanked by 2 crossed arrows. My blood ran cold. Most Marines wouldn't recognize that symbol. But someone who spent long enough around Tier 1 units would. It wasn't a decorative tattoo. It was a mark, a quiet signature shared only by those who'd run black missions with SEAL teams, those who had been the unseen hand in the darkest corners of combat operations. And here was Briggs, gripping her like she was some lost civilian looking for a vending machine. He barked for her ID, his voice rising, drawing the attention he craved. She didn't move, didn't resist, didn't flinch. Just said, again, "Please let go." The calmness wasn't fear. It was something far more dangerous. The mess hall went quiet. Not fully, but the kind of quiet where conversations shrink and eyes drift sideways because everyone senses a line is being crossed. Briggs shoved her again, sending her stumbling into a table. Her hand braced the edge, but her posture never crumpled. She reset her footing like a soldier readying for recoil. I saw her eyes sharpen, saw her inhale through her nose, a grounding breath that people trained for high-risk operations used to stabilize their heart rate. And that's when I left my seat. Because the moment he raised his hand again, everything instinct told me that he wasn't just picking a fight. He was about to pick the wrong one. I stepped out into the hallway and dialed the only number that mattered in that moment. The sergeant major. "You need to get to the mess hall," I said. "Now." He asked why. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. By the time I returned to the doorway, Briggs had escalated. He was inches from her face, red with frustration, trying to use size and rank to intimidate someone who had likely walked through worse threats blindfolded. Then it happened. So fast the room didn't register it until it was over. Briggs grabbed her wrist. She pivoted. One smooth, precise motion. No wasted energy. No hesitation. In less than a second, he was on the floor, flat on his back, gasping from the shock of having his own momentum turned against him. She didn't strike him. She didn't harm him. She simply neutralized him the way a trained operator neutralizes a threat with minimal force. And she stepped back, hands open, ready but not aggressive. The room froze. Conversation stopped. Forts hung midair. You could feel the crackle of realization moving through the Marines like electricity. This wasn't normal. This wasn't a civilian. This was someone dangerous in a way most of them had never seen. Then the doors slammed open. And when the base commander walked in, with the sergeant major at his shoulder, both men moving with that rare combination of urgency and fury, every Marine in that hall understood instantly. They weren't here for Briggs. They were here for her. And whatever Briggs thought she was, he was about to learn exactly how catastrophically wrong he'd been. The moment the colonel and the sergeant major stormed into the mess hall, the atmosphere shifted from tense to electric, as if the entire building exhaled in a single, stunned breath. Marines shot to attention instinctively. Except for Briggs, still sprawled on the ground in a daze, blinking up at the ceiling like he couldn't quite understand how gravity had betrayed him so suddenly, and Talia Reyes, who stood calmly beside the overturned tray as if she were simply waiting her turn in line. What struck me most was the way the commander's eyes went straight to her, bypassing every ranking Marine in the room as though the entire crowd were background noise. It was only when the colonel stopped directly in front of Talia that I saw something I'd never seen before. Not fear, not anger, but reverence, the kind of respect reserved for people whose stories get whispered, not spoken. Briggs finally scrambled upright, smoothing his uniform, preparing to launch into some defensive explanation. But he froze when the colonel snapped into a salute so crisp the entire room echoed with its final snap. "Lieutenant Commander Reyes," the colonel said, voice thrumming with something fierce and dangerously close to all. "Welcome back." If a bomb had detonated in the mess hall, it wouldn't have caused a bigger reaction. A few Marines gasped out loud. Someone dropped their fork. Briggs turned pale, the color draining from his face like someone had pulled a plug. Talia didn't return the salute. She couldn't, not after medical retirement. But she acknowledged it with a nod that carried more authority than any uniform. And that was when the colonel faced the room, sweeping his gaze across every Marine packed into that space. His jaw clenched hard enough to crack a tooth. "You have just put hands on one of the most decorated operators this country has ever produced." His voice had a razor edge, the kind that slices more effectively than shouting. He didn't need to yell. Shame did the yelling for him. The sergeant major stepped forward next, folding his arms, his voice low and rumbling like distant thunder. "Lieutenant Commander Reyes served as an embedded specialist on missions we can't even brief at top secret levels. She has saved more American lives than half this base combined." He looked at Briggs, directly, without blinking. "And you laid your hands on her." A ripple of murmurs passed through the room. Quiet, stunned, horrified, because no one had any clue who she was, and that ignorance now felt like a collective failure. Briggs swallowed hard, his throat working like each breath was scraping against something sharp, but he still tried to stammer out something resembling an excuse. "Sir, I didn't know." She wasn't in uniform, The colonel cut him off with a single raised hand. "You didn't look, Staff Sergeant." "That's worse." He turned to Talia. "Ma'am, are you injured? Do you require medical attention?" It was surreal, watching a Marine colonel address a woman in civilian clothing with the same level of formality reserved for four-star officers. Talia shook her head. "No, sir." Her voice was steady, the same quiet composure she'd shown throughout the entire ordeal, but I noticed her posture shift slightly, shoulders squaring, chin lifting just a fraction, as if years of muscle memory were pulling her back into command mode, whether she wanted it or not. The sergeant major gestured to the MPs. "Escort Staff Sergeant Briggs to holding for Article 128, but Talia raised a hand, stopping him. "No," she said firmly. "He doesn't need to be arrested." That stunned us more than anything else. Even Briggs froze mid-breath. "Ma'am?" the sergeant major asked. Another shake of her head. He needs correction, not punishment. The Corps can handle its own. The colonel hesitated, clearly torn between respecting her judgment and enforcing military protocol, but ultimately nodded. When Talia made a call, people listened. Briggs looked like he wanted to collapse from relief, but the sergeant major shut that down instantly with a glare that could have melted steel. "You're not off the hook, Marine," he growled. "You're on thin ice, so transparent I can see the bottom." Then, addressing the crowd, he barked, "Formation on the parade deck in 20 minutes. Full base. I don't care what you're doing, drop it." That command alone told every Marine in the hall that this wasn't just a disciplinary situation. This was about making an example. Briggs was escorted out, not in cuffs, but in a silent, shame-filled walk that might as well have been a perp walk. The rest of the mess hall stayed frozen, like no one quite knew how to move or breathe correctly anymore. Talia simply stood there, hands at her sides, surveying the room, not with pride, not with superiority, but with a strange sadness, as if she'd seen this pattern before, too many times, in too many places where egos outweighed discipline. The colonel motioned for her to follow him, and as they walked out, Marines parted like water around a ship's bow. No commands, no orders, just instinctive respect. I stepped out behind them, watching Briggs climb into the MP vehicle, his hands trembling even though he tried desperately to hide it. I couldn't help but think how in the span of a few minutes he had gone from the loudest voice in the room to the most silent man on the base. And as the colonel led Talia toward his office, I heard him say softly, but with a weight that suggested the entire next chapter of this story was about to unfold. "We need to discuss how to handle this, Commander. They need to know who you are." Talia didn't respond right away. She just looked out across the parade deck, where Marines were already rushing to formation. "No," she said finally. "They need to know who they're supposed to be." And with that, she stepped forward into the sunlight, her presence so unmistakably commanding that every Marine who saw her that day would remember it for the rest of their careers. 20 minutes later, the entire base stood assembled on the parade deck, a sea of uniforms stretching in perfect formation under the sharp afternoon sun. But even from a distance you could feel the tension crackling through the ranks, the kind of tension that comes when every Marine senses that something unprecedented is about to happen. I took my place along the perimeter beside a few other instructors, all of us watching in a silence so heavy it felt ceremonial. At the far end of the deck, Staff Sergeant Briggs stood alone, separated from the formation, his shoulders stiff, his eyes fixed straight ahead in a desperate attempt to cling to whatever discipline he could salvage. But the tremor in his jaw gave him away. The colonel stepped up to the podium, flanked by the sergeant major, and behind them, standing slightly apart, not seeking attention but incapable of blending in, stood Lieutenant Commander Talia Reyes. She wasn't in uniform, yet every Marine present seemed to stand a little straighter whenever they looked her way, because now they knew. The colonel began by recounting the incident, not in a way that humiliated Briggs, but in a way that underlined the gravity of what had happened, the danger of assumptions, the failure of leadership, the responsibility of every Marine to uphold values before ego. His voice echoed across the field as he explained who Talia Reyes was, or at least the parts of her service record he was legally allowed to share. A decorated operator who had run missions in countries whose names were still classified, a specialist whose quick thinking saved multiple SEALs during a compromised extraction, a woman whose injury came from protecting people who never even knew her name. As the details washed over the formation, you could see the shock ripple from row to row, some Marines stiffening, others lowering their gaze, all of them grappling with the realization that the quiet woman they'd ignored in the mess hall was someone whose career eclipsed everything they'd ever imagined for themselves. When the colonel finished, the sergeant major stepped forward and called Briggs to the front. The sound of his name echoing across the deck was sharp, unforgiving. Briggs marched stiffly, each step radiating humiliation and dread, but also something else, something quieter, like regret cutting through the fog of pride. He stopped in front of the podium, facing the entire base, and from where I stood I could see a bead of sweat trailing down the back of his neck. The sergeant major didn't ask him to explain himself. Instead, he said, "Do you understand the magnitude of the mistake you made today, Staff Sergeant?" Briggs swallowed hard. "Yes, First Sergeant," he whispered. "Louder," the sergeant major barked. Yes, First Sergeant. His voice cracked. The colonel nodded once, then turned to Talia. Commander Reyes, is there anything you wish to say before we take disciplinary action? Every Marine leaned forward almost imperceptibly, waiting, wondering if she'd unleash the fury she had every right to wield. But Talia stepped closer to Briggs, her expression calm, not gentle, not angry, just profoundly steady. Staff Sergeant, she began, her voice carrying across the deck with a clarity that made every Marine listen as if their careers depended on it. I'm not here to destroy you. I'm here to remind you, and all of you, what it means to wear this uniform. She gestured to the formation. Strength isn't in the volume of your voice, or the stripes on your sleeves, or how loudly you can assert authority. Strength is restraint. Strength is awareness. Strength is knowing that the smallest, quietest person in the room might be the one who once dragged bleeding teammates out of a collapsing building while mortars fell overhead. The entire deck seemed to freeze. Talia continued, "You don't have to know every person's story. You just have to remember they have one." Then she looked Briggs in the eye, directly, unwavering. "You don't owe me an apology. You owe yourself an adjustment." Briggs's face crumpled, not in defeat, but in understanding. He nodded, unable to speak. Talia turned to the colonel. "Let the Corps rehabilitate him," she said simply, and stepped back. The colonel gave the command, and Briggs was dismissed from the formation. Not discharged, not destroyed, but given a second chance under the strict supervision of the sergeant major, whose expression promised a long, hard road ahead. As Briggs shuffled away, the colonel addressed the base once more. "Let this be the day we remember who we are," he said, "and who we serve beside, even when we don't recognize them." Then he stepped aside, signaling the end of the assembly. But no one moved. Not because they were frozen in shock, but because Talia Reyes, still standing near the podium, had become the silent gravity anchoring every Marine on that field. Slowly, one by one, Marines began approaching her. Not to ask questions, not to pry, but to nod, salute, or simply acknowledge that they had witnessed something that would shape their careers and their character for years to come. She returned each gesture with quiet humility, never once acting like the hero the colonel described. That was the thing about people like her, the real operators, the ones who had seen enough trauma, enough loss, enough impossible missions to last lifetimes. They carried their legends lightly. As the crowd dispersed and the sun dipped lower across the deck, I watched Talia walk toward the base's exit, her silhouette cutting clean lines through the fading light. Marines stepped aside instinctively, creating a path without being told. Not out of fear, out of respect, out of understanding, out of growth. And as she disappeared beyond the gates, it struck me how fitting it was that someone who had spent her life walking into danger without recognition would leave the same way, quietly, without fanfare, without expecting anything in return. But her impact lingered behind her like a long shadow. Because that day, the base didn't just meet a legend. It learned from her, and it would never forget her name. Lieutenant Commander Talia Reyes, the ghost who walked among Marines and reminded them what true strength looks like.